Bruce, I want to welcome you to the Rising Beyond podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
My great pleasure, Sybil. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we are talking about something that is less talked about, and I have actually had a difficult time finding people willing to talk about this with me. And so I just really am excited for you to be here. We are talking about officer involved domestic violence.
Yes, we are sometimes referred to as PPDV instead of OIDV because everything, subtle or otherwise, matters. And I find as I near the 3-year mark since my daughter's was murdered by another police officer, that there's a very deliberate and intentional effort to shroud, cloak, and otherwise obscure this whole field in mystery, silence, absolute ignorance, and indifference. And calling it OIDV itself, officer involved domestic violence, is a sort of a passive way to describe a very violent, physical, and immediate aggressive action and behavior, criminal behavior. And there are those in the field who prefer it be referred to as PPDV, police perpetrated domestic violence, because involved could be anything. It happened in the same zip code the officer was in, or did the cop do the thing? And that more direct, aggressive marrying of the actor and the action, I think, is more appropriate. But I understand the OIDV acronym's taken off, and that's what's generally used, so I use it. But I think it all matters, and some of it's subtle.
Yeah, and so for those of you listening, Bruce and I connected on LinkedIn, and we connected partly on this about the importance of language and having it very cleanly put out there of what's actually going on. So, examples like, an underage woman assaulted by boss or something like that. It's not an underage woman, it is a child. Right? So language matters. So yes, police perpetrated, and we're going to talk a lot about all of these things, but can you share as much as you're comfortable about your story and why you are really loudly advocating for change?
I absolutely can, and I'm willing to talk about any part of it, because even in its frank brutality, I think that's the kind of information that needs to get out there so people understand this is not an academic exercise. This isn't something that won't happen to you or doesn't happen anywhere near you. And in fact, I'm just going to divert briefly and tell you that somebody who's very active in the field of OIDV, who teaches nationally and lectures at seminars throughout the country to law enforcement professionals, frequently faces a room full of law enforcement officers who essentially fold their arms and close their brains, eyes, and ears and say, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't happen in my agency. It doesn't happen in my department. It doesn't happen in my neck of the woods. And this person was just speculating that it would be a useful exercise to have handy a list of recent OIDV, I'm going to stick with the OIDV, incidents in each of the 50 states, so that when those arms get folded and those brains shut off, that document could be pulled out and say, I'm sorry, where do you live? And there they could show them, are you aware of these cases? They just happened in your neck of the woods. So it occurred to me that that was an exercise I'd be willing to tackle myself. I'm retired. I'm a retired commercial construction manager. I know how to use Google. And so I just sat at a keyboard for way too short a time. It's frightening. It's shocking how easy it was to compile a list of recent, and by recent, we said within 2 years, OIDV incidents in each of the 50 states. There was a multiplicity of incidents in every state, except North Dakota and South Dakota, which are sparsely populated. So I assume because of that, there's fewer incidents. But it was shocking and disturbing that you could so readily put together that list and choose from a whole bunch of episodes. So there is no systemic or systematic compilation of events. And again, that's by design. The law enforcement culture doesn't want there to be reporting in any formal sense. The FBI doesn't compel, like they do with they used to call it Uniform Crime Reports, the UCR, now it's NIBRs. They require agencies. It's about 18,000 or so law enforcement agencies of all sizes, shapes, whatever, around the country. They have to report certain types of crime. That's not one of them, OIDV. And anybody will tell you that you can't have good policy if you don't have good data. And we don't have good data because they don't want to have good data. They don't want to admit there's a problem.
Yeah.
However, I can say with certainty that if you can get law enforcement command staffs, executive leadership, higher echelon folks to talk frankly off the record, they all uniformly acknowledge it happens, it exists, they know it. They'll frequently call it the dirty little secret of law enforcement for a reason, because that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. And they don't, the culture doesn't permit them to face up to the fact that it happens, because it's, you could fill books with the reasons they don't, but primarily they're cultural. So what happened to me? My wife and I raised 3 children in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. They all graduated from college, and they all 3 went into law enforcement. One after a combat tour in Afghanistan with the United States Army, one after, 10 or 12 years as an EMS professional and a firefighter, and my youngest, our daughter, Abigail Rose Bieber, after graduating from University of Maryland, came down to the Tampa Bay region and joined the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office as a deputy. And her brothers soon followed thereafter and joined different agencies nearby in the same Tampa Bay region. And my wife and I retired, and within 7 months of our showing up from the DC area to the Tampa Bay region, 7 months later, Abby was dead. She had gone on a mini vacation, an extended weekend trip with 2 other deputy couples, 6 people, 3 couples. 1 woman was a civilian. Everyone else was a deputy with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Mm-hmm. They'd rented a home on the beach in St. Augustine. She had been in a relationship with a guy named Dan Layden for 7-8 months. It was an on-again, off-again thing. It never really took deep root with her. She always kept him at a distance, and he was always way out ahead of his skis, sort of planning the wedding, if you will, picking out the drapes in the home. And she was like, slow your roll, dude. I don't even know if I want to see you next week, let alone, next month. And this trip was a make or break it thing. If he showed some promise and she said, listen to her, maybe, there'd be a future. There had been no signs of abuse. This wasn't I now know far more about the cycle and the pattern, sadly. It was still in the love bombing phase, where he's Mr. Hospitable, gracious, gentlemanly, kind, hadn't started doing the coercion and control thing yet. And the night before they were due to come home, she wasn't even staying in the room with him. She was staying on a couch in a common area. For reasons we don't know, he induced her to come into his room, lock the door, and shot her in the head 3 times, then killed himself. The other deputies retreated to a closet where they hid for almost 2 hours and did nothing. That's sort of a sad and upsetting and disappointing fact. And I know this because I have the 911 calls and records from St. Johns County where this happened. And they called 911 and asked for the first responders up there to try to help save their friend, but they themselves didn't go down the hall and try to save their friend. And not really relevant to my mission and why we're here, but it's important that, they told us they weren't armed. They're cops. Cops frequently take their guns with them everywhere, not always. And after her death, those deputies, we met them at the funeral and other times, and they lied to us and told us that they didn't have their guns, and it turned out one of them did have his gun on him, and yet they feared an ambush, supposedly, and would only leave that house going out a window with the fire department ladder. I mean, when I tell the story to other cops, they're shocked, and they can't believe it, and they can't believe they weren't fired. I approached the sheriff of Hillsborough County directly about it. He basically told me to mind my own business and not to armchair quarterback it, failing to recognize I'm talking about my daughter who's never coming home, and I have every right to stay and ask and do whatever I want. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So Abby is essentially slaughtered, assassinated by this guy because she's going to leave him. The other friends do nothing. The other deputies come, clear the house, and at 2:50 in the morning, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, these deputies
Oh, yep.
are at my door. That's a Ring camera snapshot. I looked out the window. They didn't have to utter a single syllable of a single word
You knew.
to tell me what. Yeah, you just know. And it's it's what you fear. After having had a son go to combat and join a police force for years, another son, firefighter, EMT, and also a police officer, and then our daughter for 4 years. You live on a knife's edge all the time as a parent, and that's what you're trying to avoid, that image.
Mm-hmm.
And then it happened. And 2 or 3 days after that, while we didn't know what end was up, and your life goes into a suspended animation. It's everything is reconstituted and is different and will never be the same. But we come to be at a procession. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is leading to, we're in the Tampa Bay region. St. Augustine's a good 2.5 hours or so away. Abby's lying dead in a morgue up there, and they're going to bring her body back to be buried in our area. Our brothers wanted to be a part of the procession, so they did a big escorted motorcade across the state. It's on the news, and my wife and I, saw fit to see the procession off in the morning. And a deputy approaches me after, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office deputy, who was unknown to me until that moment, comes up to me and my wife, and I don't know why. I asked him if he knew Dan Layden, the guy that killed Abby. And I don't know why it occurred to me to ask, but it did. And he just started bubbling over. Oh, absolutely, I knew him. And I sensed he had something to say. And he immediately starts telling me about how he had been on a call 6 years earlier, that Dan Layden was the subject of a domestic violence call. He was the bad actor in a DV call.
Yeah.
And my head just exploded. It was the weight of 1,000 universes on my head. I was already dealing with my daughter's death, and now this guy is standing before me telling me that this agency knew. I didn't even need to hear the facts of what happened. All he said was it was a DV call. And when I heard that,
Yep.
I was like, what? They knew this guy was, and I was literally trembling. I got in the car. I remember staring at his name tag because I knew this was going to somehow come back, and I wanted to be sure I knew who the heck it was who told me this. And I dashed off this incoherent text to myself outlining the facts of what he told me and who he was. Didn't tell my wife anything, didn't mention it to the sergeant. Get back to the house, get through the funeral. My son and I are driving one day to do something to prepare for the funeral, and just the two of us, and he gives me this look and a sound of horror. I mean, I'm like, we've already been through so much. And he's like, Dad, I got something I got to tell you. Like, oh my God, what?
Yeah.
And he says, there's a video going around. A woman has come out of the woodwork and claims to have been victimized in the most brutal fashion by Dan Layden, this deputy, and put out an Instagram video. Her name's China Ratner. She's since married, is now China Perkins. And China is a social media influencer in the Tampa Bay region, and put out a very, very emotional video summarizing the awful, awful treatment and abuse she suffered at Dan Layden's hands. And because I'm such a genius, I figured out, oh my God, that could be the very episode that other guy was talking about. It's the one and the same event. And in fact, we later learned it was. And so China Ratner goes public with a whole bunch of information about how she too suffered, but fortunately for her, didn't end up dead. And that put us in a very different posture. With my sons and I, we still had the funeral to get through. We didn't want to burden their mother, my wife, with it yet, but then we felt, you know what, we got to. So all four of us shared all the information we knew, and we kept waiting for the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office to come forward and tell us, oh, by the way, the guy that killed your daughter, we knew about it. I don't know. To this day, I don't know why they didn't. We're going to find out about it. Why don't you tell us and get ahead of it? But it goes to the very systemic tendency and culture of law enforcement to just sweep it under the rug. Don't talk
Yep.
about it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't say anything, do anything, and it'll go away. And we're sitting here going, our daughter's dead at the hands of a guy that you knew had some kind of tendency to be violent. And what'd you do about it? Nothing. And so after the funeral, the gloves came off. The sheriff is all about, oh, you lost a daughter, but you got 4,000 new brothers and sisters in blue. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And at the time, I have to tell you, it's meaningful because you're so desperate for any kind of sense of
Yeah.
normalcy or support and comfort. And, they're sending people by who tell stories about the people who worked with her, telling wonderful stories about her. And people bring food and all the things that happen post-death. But that fades away. And I have
Mm-hmm.
questions. She's my daughter. She's gone. And now I have information that leads me to believe it could have been avoided. And damn it, I want answers. So the sheriff, oh, anything you need, Mr. Bieber, I'm here for you. Call me. Here's my cell. Well, I do start calling him. And there
Yep.
clearly came a time when he's not so willing to help anymore
No, it's like the
because,
anything you need turned out
yeah,
to not be fully accurate statement.
oh God, there was not at all. It was quite the contrary. I said, I want a meeting with everybody who was on that call 6 years earlier. I told you there was a sergeant who drove us to the procession. They were kind enough to send us. Well, it turns out that man's very wife was one of the deputies who, along with the guy that told me about it, was on that call too. And
Yeah.
I, he had reached out to my wife on Facebook, and so we were sort of friendly with him. And I said, do you think your wife would want to talk to me about it? Because I wanted to talk to people who were there.
Mm-hmm.
And at the China Ratner episode in 2016. And he said, oh, I'm sure she'll talk to you. And I do remember she was very upset. So that's two people who were there who were very upset at what happened afterwards, or I should say more importantly, what didn't happen afterwards. That guy
Yeah.
told me he should have been fired. And the other woman said, the sergeant's wife, she told me she couldn't sleep for a day or two after. It was that. We're talking about cops, not rookies, cops who see awful
Yeah.
things day in, day out. They were so disturbed by this guy's behavior that day that they knew it was wrong. But again, it was that cultural close the door, blue line of silence, circle the
Yeah.
wagons,
Protect our
protect our own,
own.
that prevented it from going anywhere. So I say to the sheriff, I want everybody who was on that call in a room, and my sons are just naturally brilliant and trained detectives. One's literally a
Mm-hmm.
detective now. He wasn't at the time. And I actually went to law school at one point. It's not particularly relevant. I'm not bragging, but I'm saying it because my son, who never went to law school, knows more about law than I ever will. Okay. He's just
Mm-hmm.
naturally so smart and so good. His recollection is near perfect. So he knows the law. He knows police procedures, both of them. And we wanted to all be in a room with all of those people and really dissect what happened, what didn't happen. And I was still on the learning curve at that point where I was just getting my feet wet in this OIDV thing in an academic sense, talking to the practitioners, the nation's foremost experts,
Mm-hmm.
and reading papers, reading books, learning about the entire cycle and syndrome of domestic violence, and in particular OIDV, a subset of an awful thing. And by the way,
Yeah.
DV generally in the civilian context generates some of the hottest calls cops get and kills more cops than almost anything. I don't know if car crashes or DV calls. It's ridiculously high number of officer deaths
Yeah.
arise from DV calls. So it's in their interest not to sweep it under the rug, whether it's their people perpetrating it or
You would
not.
you would think so.
You would
You
if
would
you
think
were
they
at
would want to
all
learn so much about this.
everything about it. And it's there to know. So the sheriff says, yes, Mr. Bieber, we'll get everybody together. And, it doesn't happen. And they do get a meeting with the chief deputy and one person who was there and a guy from IA who supposedly did the internal affairs. This is
Mm-hmm.
kind of I think this is a joke, but I started doing public records requests. Florida supposedly has some of the best sunshine laws that allow you to
Yeah.
gain access to public records. That's the theory. In practice, not so much. When China Ratner's Instagram video went public, and I don't know, a couple 100,000 people saw it, their PIO, their Public Information Office, and by they I
Mm-hmm.
mean Hillsborough County, put out a statement saying we're aware of the serious allegations raised by China Ratner about one of our deputies, and we've opened an investigation. If you know anybody, or anything, blah, 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 call. And of course, if you're in crisis, call this number. And
Yeah.
so I, again, because I'm a genius, said, well, I'm going to do a public records request and ask for that investigation. This is now, I don't know, a year and a half or so later. The response I get is there's no investigation. There's nothing there.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, what do you mean there's nothing there? You yourself said you're doing an investigation. The time's long since ended when any reasonable amount of time that investigation should be done. What do you mean there's no deliverable, no report, no document saying we looked into this and there's, even if it's a negative outcome, to say there was nothing to report, say that. But they said there's nothing. And I'm like, well, that can't be. You start an investigation, you say you did it, you have an IA person who says he did something, but you can't produce a single document. And so we have that guy in the room now, and it was like Alice in Wonderland. It was like people talking in tongues and people speaking English. It was incomprehensible how, with a straight face, that man could sit there and tell us, we don't have anything. Well, this happened, you said you're doing. I mean, it's very linear to me, and yet none of us could understand it. It was a joke. They just, it's no different than this. They're just saying, nope, it's not there. It didn't happen. Prove it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the gaslighting of our larger systems of people who are trying to learn more what's going on and hold anyone accountable is so huge. Such a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's gaslighting at the highest order. And as somebody pointed out to me, there's a thing called propaganda, this tendency for agencies to put out videos of them doing happy stuff like saving ducklings from drains. Look at our heroic deputies. And Hillsborough is terrific at that. They're very, very good at that. Look, here's our deputy petting a goat. It's feel-good stuff. But if you're going to do that, you should, if you claim to be transparent, own the bad stuff too. Yes, cops do wonderful things. My sons are cops. My daughter was a cop. I am not anti-cop in the slightest. I'm anti-bad cop. And if you're a batterer, if you're a cop who beats an intimate partner, you are a criminal. And you swore an oath to defend and protect. And how dare you hide behind that badge and not be held to account for the same thing that you yourself as a cop would arrest your neighbor, your civilian neighbor, for doing. That strikes me as the fundamental problem and why I'm here. They will do that given the chance. If you give them the authority, the power, and prevent them from shining light on this, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to allow them to be criminals, and they'll be complicit in that crime rather than say, yeah, this is a bad egg who committed a crime and they shouldn't be able to wear that badge, not in this town, not in this agency or neighboring agency or the neighboring state. I mean, there are people that just shouldn't be cops. I mean, if you can't honor the oath, don't be a cop. It's not for everyone. But I also recognize the incredible value. We as a civil society make a pact with each other to designate a subset of us to do this horrible, thankless task. That is to say, be cops. And I don't know if you've ever done a ride-along. I don't think anybody should be able to vote or, I don't know, have a driver's license without doing a ride-along. See what it, walk in another man's shoes, right? Another person's shoes. It's a thankless job. And they put up with a lot, and they get heaps and heaps of abuse. And frankly, nobody speaks for them. There is no national spokesperson advocating for the plight of police officers. And I find that a shocking omission as well, by the way. So as much as I'm going to be critical in the OIDB context, and I think it's fair, I also think they need to be celebrated, honored, and revered for what they do when they do it right. And that's not a partisan thing. That's not an anti-cop thing. I'm not saying defund cops, but I'm saying if you're on pick a shift, the night shift, and the guy next to you is dealing crack and robbing banks every third Thursday of the month, you're not going to remain mute and put up with that because you understand that that's just wrong. And it reflects on you, it reflects on your agency, it reflects on the profession, and it's beyond the pale. But because the society views, I think, abuse of women through a very different lens, you're allowed to beat your kids, kick your dog, beat your wife. Why not, right? It's all one and the same.
Yeah.
And I'm going to mind my own business. That's his business. He beats his wife, kicks his dog, smacks his children. That's not my business. Well, guess what? It is, and it's wrong, and it's got to change in
And
an
I was
industry.
going to say, you brought up a lot of different things of why this is so important. It's really sad as a therapist, as a professional working with victims and survivors, that I actually have to tell my clients when they are asking about going to file a police report that I actually feel like it's the caveat is it depends on who is at the window when you show up. Because not only are they complicit within the system, those officers who are abusers, they are less likely to perform correctly or perform in a way that is to protect other victims and survivors when they show up at the home. And so having people that have a pattern of coercive control over other people, lack of empathy, all of these things on the force is impacting everybody. Because why aren't you going to speak up? Because you fear that person, right? So
Absolutely.
there's that level of threat and fear within the department that allows that culture to remain as it is. Those are the people you should fear. If we look at allowing, right, I don't know the numbers, right? I don't know the real numbers, but
Yeah.
50% of police officers, they do in their hearts want to protect and serve. You have this other half of officers who really like the power and control that being a police officer gives you. And those are very different police officers.
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, you're right. Nobody knows the real numbers, and that brings up the question of selection. How do you weed out the bad
Mm-hmm.
eggs? How do you test for the whatever the criteria are that tip off the fact that this is a bad egg, not a good egg that we should have? And by the way, doing so in a climate of anti-cop sort of sentiment when
Yeah.
it's incredibly difficult for them to recruit, so they have to lower
Yeah.
standards, which cuts against this. Now you're going to get more bad apples. And I suspect it's greater than 50%, by the way, because we can't really know for sure because all of my three kids all went into law enforcement. We tend to know their friends and some of them. And I get the sense it's not a 50-50 proposition, if that's any comfort to you from my limited perspective. It's greater than that, the number that may
Yeah.
be power mad and whatnot. But I can tell you that the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is incredibly well funded, very sophisticated, uses the best techniques, the best practices with respect to selection and hiring, and among other things that I requested in my public records request were this guy's application. And I've talked to some of the nation's experts on forensic psychological autopsies and whatnot. What is it that we
Mm-hmm.
miss? What can we do better with cops who kill themselves and or murder? And there's no clear answer. There's no firm answer. Now, if they
Yeah.
killed pets, if they're children and they're, killing cats, okay, problem, right? We know that.
Yeah.
If they've ever been charged with domestic abuse, yeah, problem. But other than that, there seem to be few indicia of that sort of future bad behavior. Now, this guy lied on his application about something about a college roommate 2 years earlier. I think they could have caught that and should have caught that, but they didn't. And but
Mm-hmm.
even if they had, he was so manipulative. He was such a high functioning predator. And by the way, China Ratner later said that after her video went public, that I think it was 8 other women came approached her and said, "Oh, me too, me too." So
Yeah.
they didn't want to go public with it, but they were willing to tell her that they too had been abused at his hands. Now, obviously, if my daughter had knowledge of that, she would have run screaming, right? And she'd be alive.
Well, what we had talked about before is that it is mind boggling that we have research. We know what makes things a highest risk factor for fatalities. And yet, the people that are in the place to protect and who could make a difference, law enforcement, they don't know. They
No,
have
you're
no
right. And
idea.
you're exactly right. Just like cops don't know the 750% thing, they're not aware that over it was 1999, so that's 25 years ago. 25 years ago, the IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, convened a panel of experts, 360 degrees around OIDV specifically, and
Mm-hmm.
said, look, guys, gals, let's sink our teeth into this OIDV thing and figure it out and come up with a plan. And they developed a model policy of OIDV training. And well, two things, a training regimen and a model policy, that a prescription that could be sent out to the 18,000 different law enforcement agencies for adoption and revision as
Yeah.
necessary. I mean, you could have a 3-person department in this town, small town, or, a 30, I don't know, I think the NYPD has 30,000 people, I think, sworn
Yeah.
officers. So it's a small army. So one size is not going to fit all, obviously, with regard to a policy, because they don't all have the same resources and abilities or needs, but that they should all have a policy that contemplates the fact that, hey, it's likely, guys and gals, that some among you are going to be the offender. You're going to be the perpetrator. Maybe that's the guy next to you, to the left or the right, but one of you might be the bad person, the bad actor, when we show up on a DV call. And what then? What do we do? Well, the IACP answered that. And just as I tell you, people, cops, just anecdotally, who I bump into, don't know the 750% thing. What? The IACP put out a model policy 25 years ago? Who knew? Well,
yeah,
some know, many don't. Far fewer than half the states have adopted any kind of policy at all, as I understand it. And try to find hard facts on that fact alone, by the way, it's not easy. Finding any fact with any certainty in the OIDV context, I find, leads to murkier, and murkiest. It's like you never get a definitive answer because it's by design, as I said earlier. They don't want to acknowledge it, and you can't regulate what you don't know. What's that Einstein's formulation? If I have an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes solving it. Well, the clock hasn't started on the 55-minute part yet, because they won't even acknowledge there's a problem. And that has to start. And the IACP started it 25 years ago. And there are notorious cases of OIDV that have triggered a succession of positive efforts that flowed in the wake of tragedy. I don't know if you're familiar with any of them, and it's not a test by any means, but there was a woman named Michelle O'Connell in St. Augustine who was killed by a deputy boyfriend. And the agency, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office, covered it up. The New York Times did a very deep dive. Frontline, the PBS production house, did a terrific piece called The Death in St. Augustine, which I highly recommend. That happened 14 years ago. That was 2010, 14 years ago.
What we've been talking about is there are so many cases, and I think we talked about this offline before we hit record, was there are cases that are in the news. They have the documentary series. They're on 60 Minutes. But there are so many more that nobody has heard about.
One of the most well-known ones is Tacoma, Washington. In 2013, Crystal Brame, her husband was the chief of the Tacoma Police Department. And he pulled up in a parking lot next to her. She in her car, he in a different car with their 2 children in his car. Got out of the car, went over, shot her in the head. Then he shot himself in front of the kids. She lived a week and then died. In that 1 week interval, her dad, a guy named Lane, Lane Judson, her name was Crystal Judson before marrying Brame, promised his dying daughter he would do everything he could to make sure it didn't happen to somebody else, and spent the rest of his life, I think he died in 2018, seeking passage of a federal act. And it happened. They did sign a Crystal Brame Violence Against Women Act. He got a shelter built in Tacoma with funds that I guess they won or settled a lawsuit and got a bunch of money from the city. And he traveled and he taught and he lectured and harangued people into paying attention to this. And so you have a case 14 years ago, a case 11 years ago. And then I think it was only 8 years ago in Silver City, New Mexico, a woman named Nikki Bascom was shot and killed by a former boyfriend cop. And in every one of those cases, Brame Michelle O'Connell, and Nikki Bascom, Bascom. Everybody knew when they did investigations after the fact. It was well known these were abusive people. Less so in Jeremy Banks, the Michelle O'Connell shooter, but it was known that he was troubled, that he had problems with aggression and drinking, and they'd had fighting going on, and all indicia of trouble. The other two, even more out there. And I've heard it said by people who knew some of them that these are people that never should have been police officers. So people went around in their day-to-day job knowing this is a person who shouldn't carry a badge and a gun, but they abide it and they go about their daily business. That has to stop. And those are the shocking, blunt cases. The subtle ones, well, like in my daughter's case, this guy was a high-functioning, very slick operator. I'm sitting in a home that he frequented. He was swam in my pool. He ate at our table. This is a guy who worked his wiles and co-opted us. Hi, Mrs. Bieber. Look, I know you like these. Here's some glasses. Gifts for our grandchildren. He super predator.
Yeah.
And a gung ho cop who they want to keep, right? So when you start saying, but he does this and he does that, they don't want to hear it, and they don't hear it. So I started to go down the path with Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, well-funded, sophisticated, best hiring practices, all that. But they don't follow the more enlightened model rules for OIDV. They don't do a trauma-informed investigation after a DV episode involving a cop. And had they done that, my daughter would be alive. So whenever
that's what I was going to ask.
What do you want? What could be done?
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask is if there was, again, there's probably lots of things that need to change, but if there were one or two things that you could, right? So I want to always offer my podcast as a platform for people for change.
Thank you.
What would be that one or two things? If this were to change, then the outcome would look better for victims and survivors of this.
It's funny. This is the hardest thing and the simplest thing at the same time, which is frequently the way life is, right? No person should graduate from any kind of law enforcement academy without being exposed to some level of OIDV training. You cannot get your arms around a problem if you don't even hint that it might exist. If we continue to keep our heads in the sand and never even utter those 4 letters, how can we expect to improve on outcomes? All cops are trained on DV calls, almost without exception. There are very, very, very few, but everybody knows DV calls are hot and unpredictable, and they're the subject of, much water cooler conversation, dinner table conversation. Everybody knows, oh my God, these officers and it's legitimate. I'm not mocking it or diminishing it at all. There's a real risk to law enforcement safety, something they all claim to care about. So they teach how to handle DV calls when it's in a civilian context. It doesn't strike me that to be a great stretch to just say, oh, and by the way, it might be one of you, or it might be a cop in the agency next door that's doing it. And if that happens, then do this, do these things, lay out the protocol. And that protocol should be, I'm usually not a fan of vernacular, trendy vernacular, but trauma-informed investigative techniques. There are ways to ask questions. It drives me mad. I'm not like you, an expert in the field or the many others I speak to. So I shouldn't be as incensed as I am already at hearing that dreaded question, why doesn't she just leave? It does nothing but betray an ignorance, a level of a lack of awareness and understanding of a devastatingly subtle, powerful, malevolent process. Mark Wynn, one of the deans in the OIDV field, says cops have to stop looking at it like an incident and look at it as a process. This isn't an isolated thing that happened in this little slice of time and space. This is an ongoing, long-standing thing. And you can fill books with why she doesn't just leave. It's so stupid.
Yep.
And I heard the sheriff, no less than the sheriff, the numero uno top guy at Hillsborough County, on the air in an interview talking about officer wellness and the resources available to their deputies that just have to make a phone call. And he's getting his aggravation and agitation is palpable. I don't understand
Mm-hmm.
it. We make all these things. It's free. There's no stigma. Why don't they just call? Which is another way of saying, why doesn't she just leave?
Yep.
And then the interviewer, TV guy, says, well, sir, you go on calls. You see the same horrible things, the stress-inducing, PTSD-inducing destruction and devastation. Do you use the services you're talking about? And he goes, oh, no, I have a wonderful wife and non-cop
I
friends.
don't
I'm like,
need them. Yeah.
oh, dude, you just missed an opportunity to be a real leader and get people. Any deputy watching that's now going to understand this. The unspoken text is, don't do that. You'll be
You
viewed
don't.
as weak, and that's not what we want here. I mean, it was so idiotic.
Yeah.
But so that if that goes on at the top of the most sophisticated agencies, I fear we have a lot of work to do. But again, to
Oh,
your
yeah.
question, what could be done? That's what could be done. A trauma-informed model policy should be should be adopted by all agencies, tailored to their individual needs. They won't all have the resources to do the proper investigations, but they can do
Mm-hmm.
mutual aid. When there's an OIS, an officer involved shooting in an agency, it's not uncommon for them you talk about foxes in hen houses, right? The fox doesn't generally investigate the hen house when there's a murder in house. They go to the agency next door, or the state,
Yeah.
go up a click to state equivalent of the FBI. Or, the next county, the next police department, somebody else does the investigation. Why in the heck do we allow an agency to investigate itself in a DV context? It seems to me entirely too easy to just say, oops, it's got the markers of an OIDV case. Boom, automatically that goes to
Goes.
somebody else. Let
Yeah.
them do the
I agree. As you were
investigation.
talking, I was like, yep, it needs to be done elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, there is a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
There are threats made by police officers to other police officers. Absolutely. And who's making those threats? The perpetrators of. That's who's making the threats. Right. And
Yes.
so, just to like keep your head down. And so that comes up actually with a lot of the professionals I work with. There's a huge fear of speaking out as loud as you can because the threat is there. So that happens as a therapist, as a child's therapist, who's going to grieve me? The abusive parent. The
Uh,
abuser is going to grieve me. They're going to try and sue me. They'll harass me. Same thing if you're a mediator who's going to be threatening to you. The abusive person. As a PRE, as anyone else who's going to be the threatening person. The
well,
abuser.
absolutely. And it's not
And so if
only,
we don't stand up, then
I
they
hate to
get to
say
do it.
this, I think it's more pernicious than that in the police context. It's not just the abuser who's going to crucify you when you rat them
Yes,
out
yes.
or dime them
Truth.
out, but they've created a construct, and it's not unreasonable. Trust me, as a father of cops,
Mm-hmm.
cops are taught, everybody's out to kill you until they prove otherwise. There's like memes and jokes about it. Be ready to kill everybody you meet until they prove themselves, worthy of not being killed. I'm overstating the mentality, but it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
far off. It's an us versus them. We have ourselves and each other, and only ourselves and each other to count on
yeah,
in this war against them, whoever them is. And them, guess what? It's everybody who's not a cop. So we have our own language, our own mores, our own ethics, our own core beliefs. And in this us versus them, cops tend to socialize. They socialize only with other cops. They marry other cops. The whole
yep,
world is frequently police. Not all, and it can be an unhealthy and toxic environment. Even when somebody inside the circle trespasses, it's a greater trespass to rat them out because now you're shunned. They can't count on you.
yeah, yep.
You have violated the oath. Not the actual oath. You are
Right.
actually
The unspoken,
the
the
unspoken oath,
unspoken
right?
oath
The
that is
cultural
there.
oath, right? And so it's culture, and I'm fond of saying culture will eat policy every time. So when you ask me, Bruce, what do you want? What do you think the fix is? And I tell you, oh, there should be mandatory OIDV policies. There should be mandatory OIDV training. Well, that's literally policy. But if the culture is, if you go down that policy road, you're going to be excommunicated. You're going to be shunned. You're going to get
Yeah,
the worst shift. Nobody's going to talk to you. Nobody's going to back you up on the hot call. Well, guess what? The culture is going to trump that policy. If that sheriff who I mentioned talks about officer wellness. That's his very reason for being there. And then he subverts his own message by, when he had the opportunity to sell it, by saying, no, I don't use it
Yeah.
myself. I'm a tough guy. I don't need that stuff. That's for wusses. It's the same cycle of culture eating policy. So we have to change the culture. Now, I'm somewhat optimistic that the 30-30 thing, 30% women in law
I
enforcement by
was
2030.
cautiously optimistic is how I
There you
usually
go.
term things.
The more women who come on the field, it's currently supposedly about 12% of law enforcement are women now. That some people like to tell me that there's going to be a millennial cultural youth driven shift, that they just won't tolerate the same old shenanigans of the old heads from years gone by. I have my doubts. I think you get acculturated
Yeah.
into that system. Although I know quite a few women cops, my daughter notwithstanding, who give me hope too. They just don't put up with nonsense, and I hope that's the case. But they're just too many entrenched, powerful, mostly men, not almost exclusively men, who dominate this culture and write the rules and the mores and the practices. And unless and until they lead by example, and there are some out there. There are some real terrific heroes. Brandon, foremost among them, who get it. And I rack my brain. How can somebody like Brandon get it so well and understand it and appreciate it and all its nuances? And yet you can have so many other people who have this retrograde notion that, nah, so what?
Yeah.
It's his business if he beats his wife. And I never want to hear that nonsense about, yeah, but she starts it. Sometimes she throws an ashtray. Okay, great. Congratulations. 4% of the time that happens. And I would also urge, as some other smarter than I have said, even in those circumstances where it isn't male on female, supposedly, that female is reacting to a cycle and a process and a long-standing relationship of abuse. She's not the primary aggressor. Yeah, she's responding to something that's been going on a long time. Another avenue for another day, maybe, about how the law statutes need to change. That there should be, frankly, a different form of or legal approach to a woman who uses deadly force to get out of an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
It's not the same kind of murder.
Yeah, that's a whole nother episode and then some with that.
Yes.
And with that, as we wrap up, is there one message? Because I came to you because I do want your family's message to be out there. I want your advocacy to be seen, because I see your advocacy not just as a part of your healing journey for your family, but I see it as a lifeline for other people whose children are in law enforcement, other women and men who expect a police officer to show up at their door and do the right thing. And so what would be your final message of hope for people who are listening?
Yeah, I think that with knowledge, with the exposure of this so-called dirty secret of law enforcement, with greater awareness that it happens. I mentioned the 50-state summary that I put together quickly. If more people knew how common this is in their neighborhood, in their agency, in their backyard, and happening to people they know, there's a lot of shame. We all know people don't want to report DV, among very many other reasons, because of the shame factor. It's even more so the case when it's a cop doing the abusing, because it's a far more daunting exercise to call. Who do you call when it's a cop doing it? But the fact remains that with the disinfectant of light, you become aware that like I said, the answers to the questions are known. When OIDV policies are put in place, I could cite you academic tests that prove they work, that the incidence goes down. Officers will report dime out, rat out, if you will, other officers and deputies when they understand it's a wrongful act, it's a criminal act. We're cops. We can do better. We should do better. We must do better. And so I know when put into place, those policies work. And if the policies work, if those cops do stand up and do the right thing and refuse to be complicit in the criminal acts of their peers, lives will be and can be saved. It's really that simple.
Yeah. Yeah, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
You
It's
don't.
already
You
there.
really don't.
It's
Like I
already
said,
there
you just
for
have to have
us.
the cultural will to tackle
Yes.
this and acknowledge,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a problem. We shouldn't
Yep.
do this.
Yep. I talk about that wanting versus willing fairly frequently. And it's the getting people to, they want something different, but are they
Yeah.
willing to do what it might take to get the change?
Well, that's a curious thing. You said you can't get people to talk about this. And you're right. I get that. And in fact, I told you a local news agency wanted to get local law enforcement to talk on screen and they wouldn't. They couldn't
Yep.
find anybody. So I went out of state. It's easier to talk about something than,
Yep.
a
It's
couple of
farther
states in between
away.
you. But it's the same syndrome, the same malevolent force and cycle and dynamic at play here. So let's keep talking. And I've already lost my daughter. I don't get her back. So I've got nothing to lose, in my view. And I have absolutely everything to gain by talking about her, Abigail Rose Bieber.
Yeah.
I miss her. I always
Yeah.
will. I don't know if I sent you a couple of things. I don't know if you saw them,
Yep.
but
Yep. Well, Bruce, I appreciate you being here. And you know that I will, from the rooftops, shout out for what I think needs to happen, and wanted to offer that as well for your family.
thank you.
So, everyone that is with me listening, know that there are people all over the world really working to make things different and make things better. So, Bruce, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yep. And thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Rising Beyond podcast.